Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tech Beats Unplugged, the podcast where we groove through the latest tech trends and dance with the rhythm of cloud possibilities. I'm your host, 𝐿𝐶𝐻𝐽, aka Cloud Dude, and I'm super hyped to be here with y'all. We have an exciting topic today, so keep it locked. Today's session is all about the thrilling open source debate. This is going to be part one because there's a lot to talk about. Joining us as a special guest is Erik Benner, the VP of Enterprise Transformation at Mythics. Erik brings a wealth of experience to our discussion, having used and sold Red Hat over the years, but also expert in another enterprise Linux distro and helped customers manage their licenses and migrate when needed. Together with Erik, we'll venture into the heart of the recent open source developments that made a lot of noise, igniting passionate debates among the OSS community. All that thanks to Red Hat announcement to go closed source not so long ago. Hey, Erik, and welcome.
Thank you for having me, and happy to answer any questions about what's gone on and how the community has responded to it.
Thank you for coming. First question, how are you?
Oh, I'm having a blast tonight. It's been a long weekend.
Great. I'm doing amazing too. I'm really excited as well. By the way, did I miss anything in the bio? But in case I did, the floor is yours, my friend. Please introduce yourself and let us know who you are.
Yep. Well, you got most of it. I work for Mythics, helping to manage pre-sales and helping our consulting group do some of the more specialized delivery projects. I'm also a published author. Actually, my next book is on Oracle Linux. It's already on pre-sale on Amazon, and it's already the #1 new Linux book. And when I last checked, it was up to the #10 Linux book overall.
Wow.
So there's a lot of interest in it, about what's going on and the technology that Oracle brings to the table, which is almost identical to what Red Hat brings.
Amazing. This is why we're having you here today, to talk about this topic, of course. Thank you, Erik. Now, before we go down the rabbit hole of OS kernels and Red Hat RPMs, I would just like to remind the listeners of the topic, which is the changing landscape of Linux OS distributions and the impact of the community from code source lockdown by big OSS vendors like Red Hat. All right. First, Erik, if you allow me, I would like to ask, since I'm a long time user of Red Hat, maybe since 2006, but have no clue on the distribution model. So could you explain Linux OS distribution like I'm 5, or maybe like I'm dumb? Because I'll be asking the dumb question today, because there's a lot to unpack, no pun intended. It's just so the random dude or girl can understand concepts like Linux Foundation, kernel, distribution, software packaging. What makes a distribution be ready and delivered at the end user?
Yeah, it's actually a good question to ask because a lot of people get confused on what a Linux distribution is. And they often think that a Linux distribution is created only by one company. And the reality, it's created by the community. So the community creates the components that make up a distribution, and then the distribution vendor takes the components from all these different products and actually builds a product or a technology. It's very similar to how a car is built in many ways. And if you look at Linux and you look at cars, there's a lot of similarities behind it. Linux itself is the kernel. It's the core engine of what makes the operating system work. And that's just like the engine in a car. And Linux is controlled by the Linux Foundation. It's an open source organization that focuses just on the kernel, just on the engine of what makes Linux Linux. But an engine without anything else doesn't do you any good. And that's where distributions come in. The next major component is, I call it transmission. And that's a lot of software that comes from the GNU, the GNU Foundation, and their organization. And they produce a lot of the commands that we're used to, like ls and cp and awk and grep and all these other basic commands that you need in order to do something with a kernel, how you interact with the kernel and how you interact with basic files. And that's done by GNU. But then you add on a whole bunch of other things into the distribution, and it's just like a car. You need seats, and there's many different companies that make car seats. Well, in Linux, maybe you need a database. There's many different companies that make databases for Linux. You have Postgres, you have MySQL, you have Oracle. Microsoft makes a database, and those are relational databases. Then you can get into the non-relational databases and the niche databases, but there's a lot of folks building those technologies. And then you might need something like an airbag to protect you. Well, that's security software. And you have a lot of things that come from different organizations to make security software. You have tools like OpenSCAP. You have tools like SE Linux that come from different organizations that build and maintain these technologies. And then you add in all the other bits that make up a car. You need doors, windows, you want an alarm system, you want seat belts. You have things like the Apache Foundation that makes the Apache web server that we use, but it makes a lot of other technologies that we use. You have the folks at Nginx that make a more simple web server that's often used in conjunction with Apache, and that comes from their organization. So what a distribution builder does is kind of like a modern car company, where most modern companies don't really make the car, they source the pieces. So they get the airbags from one company, the brakes from a company, the seat belts from the company, the actual car seats from another company. And then they have their own sheet metal shops that kind of build the look of the car. And that's kind of what you have in a distribution, is you have companies like Red Hat that they take the open source components from thousands of different projects and people and put that together in a distribution, and that's their car. It's no different than you buy a Ford or a Chevy. And as a lot of people know that work with those cars, the same brake pads work in both. The bolt holes might be different, but they're made by the same company. And some of them are even interchangeable. It doesn't matter if it's a Ford or a Chevy, it's going to be the exact same part, the exact same bolt holes. So that's kind of what a distribution does, is it bundles all these different pieces and puts it together so it's easier for you to consume and deploy and use.
That's an amazing description of how a distribution works. This reminds me of a good analogy from Jeff Gerling as well about Red Hat, where, correct me if I'm wrong, so it works like Red Hat would grab a copy of Linux, they would add magic sauce that makes it Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and they would release a new version, they would update a source code repository with all the data required to build from scratch. And there you go. This is how it works. But one more question I would like to ask is, it's of course bundling all those packages, but there is still something that Red Hat is doing in order to make that distribution at the end. So they decide on the version of that binary that will be wrapped or shipped with the distribution. They do patches as well. Could you tell me more about this part that Red Hat still does on top of gathering all those packages?
Absolutely. So Red Hat, like any distribution, is picking things or picking major versions like Apache 2.4 or Bind version 8 or whatever the technology is, or the Linux kernel itself, right? It could be a version 3 kernel, a version 4 kernel, a version 5 kernel, or even a version 6 kernel. So they're picking those major components, but a lot of those components, they're not even building. You know, the Linux Foundation actually builds the kernel, and sometimes Red Hat contributes a lot to the kernel. But there's also other cases, like there's times where Oracle contributes more to the kernel than Red Hat does. So it's a lot of different companies. And even like an example in the kernel, even companies you might not even think about contribute to the kernel. You know, you have Intel contributing to the kernel, AMD contributing to the kernel, Samsung contributing to the kernel. There's all sorts of companies that produce that code. The Linux distribution organ who build that distribution basically picks the versions behind it, but they don't necessarily pick the patches either. Since all these are built in open source, it comes from what's called an upstream provider. So in open source, you have upstream and downstream, and upstream is the source of truth. That's the organization or the people that are building the core technology. So with upstream, you might have something like the Linux kernel that comes from the Linux Foundation. You could have something for an Apache web server that comes from the Apache Foundation. You could have something that is like Zeek, that's an open source security tool that comes from the Zeek.org folks. They actually, as part of that technology that group is building and maintaining, they actually take patches that are contributed to their project to fix security bugs, to add new functionality, is the upstream provider. And then downstream are folks like Red Hat that take those patches. They take the new versions, which a patch is really a new version at that point, and they add it to their distribution. Now, in Red Hat's case, just like Oracle and just like even Facebook, a lot of these companies that build distributions also contribute to the underlying source that builds the technology. So you might have something like the XFS file system that Oracle contributes heavily to. That's put in where then Red Hat might take that code from that team that builds the XFS file system and puts that in their distribution as the primary file system for it. The patch didn't come from Red Hat. More often than not, it came from Oracle in that example. But it could be also a video driver that comes from NVIDIA as an example. And they basically are bundling it together, taking the versions, deciding what versions, curating the versions that go into it. In Red Hat's case, they do put a lot of money into developing and supporting some of these open source projects, like they did with the CentOS project as an example, and Fedora, which are more around distributions. And they do a lot of work also with some of the lower level technology, but they're not the only player that generates that content. It's produced by a large number of people.
So jumping on what you just said about spending a lot of money in contributing in open source projects, I have a candid question related to the contribution of Red Hat toward their own customers. So I've heard, or I think I read somewhere that Red Hat also makes sure that every new feature or patch is sort of retro compatible with the old version. I don't know if you can explain that better. So there's some work that's done by Red Hat in order to make sure that whatever is applied today on something is compatible on older version of Red Hat that are still being used by their customers.
It actually doesn't work that way. Generally, when a patch comes out from whoever Red Hat is an example, they have a baseline where this patch works for 8.8, and you have to be on 8.8 for this patch to work with everything else in the ecosystem. But if you're on 8.7, the patch doesn't work. You're forced to upgrade to 8.8 in order to get that patch. So it's not really its old versions. It's just that specific version of the distro at the time it was released. And you also have things for breaking things. That can also be a challenge because you could have a technology like Redis, which is a database technology. It falls in the database family of technologies, that actually multiple versions could be distributed by the distribution, by Red Hat or Oracle or Alma or Rocky or whoever. One might be in the EPEL repository and one might be in the main repository. And those two are not compatible. So it's a little more than just saying that they curate it. They do, but it doesn't always mean it's going to work. Sometimes patching, especially when they're doing version updates, major version updates, break things. And that's a little bit of a challenge as a Linux admin. You have to kind of understand what those are. Where the distro builders work is they do some base testing there, but often that base testing is around a specific version, 8.8, 8.9, 9.1, 9.2, etc. And when you get outside of that version, it's no longer necessarily going to be compatible with everything else that's in the newer release.
Interesting. All right. So let's go back to Red Hat's actions in the last 3 years, since it's a really nice segue to that section. So I would like to discuss with you the Red Hat's decision. There are 2 actions that have been done since 3 years. So the first one was done about 3 years ago, where Red Hat decided to pull the plug on CentOS as a downstream to make it an upstream distribution. And also recently, like it's been maybe a couple of weeks, the decision to close the source and close the SRPMS and the implication of that kind of action, especially to the community. So first with the CentOS move, could you explain what was that and the impact that has done to the community?
I think when you look at this, yes, they did make a change to CentOS, but I think the first change you have to look at what happened with Red Hat is the change that happened in 2019 when IBM bought them. And IBM paid a lot of money, $34 billion to buy Red Hat. And that happened in 2019. And that's one thing you have to understand kind of in the context, because prior to 2019, CentOS, as an example, was an open source project, wasn't even affiliated with Red Hat. Red Hat acquired, took control over the CentOS project. They put their people on the board and in the process took control over it with the idea behind it of it would basically track Red Hat Linux and give people the ability to do certain things they couldn't do with the mainline Red Hat distribution. But it'd track it close enough that it'd be very much compatible to it. What you then saw, though, is a year or two after that, they changed CentOS. And initially, CentOS was going to be around and have 10 years of support. And Red Hat went ahead and decided to change what CentOS was, and that it was no longer going to be a copy or a clone or a downstream of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. They were going to change its behavior to become, in some ways, upstream of Enterprise Linux, but it's really not a true upstream in that it has versions behind it. It's more of piecemeal. So from a Linux admin, you went from CentOS having versions like 8, 7, 8, 7, 6, 7, 7, 7, 8, 7, 9, 8, 1, 8, 2. And they made the decision with 8 to stop that versioning and to freeze it and move to a new model where it wasn't strictly a version like it used to be. There was no 8.3, and they did this in 2020, not quite a year after IBM bought them. And they actually changed it where it's no longer going to be a version like an 8.1 and 8.2 and 8.3. Starting in that date when they made the change announced the change in 2020, that it was going to be a stream. So it wasn't going to have a version number, and that basically software that could make it into the Red Hat distribution will be added to the stream, but it's not necessarily added in a fully curated model, and it's not added where you have specific versions like 8.4 and 8.5 like CentOS originally had. It was added where pretty much anything they decide goes into it, and if they need to pull it out, they pull it out, which made a very unstable environment for production workloads. And that was the first major change they made to CentOS there. They've done a lot of other changes too. They've done a lot of staff reductions. They've done a lot of moving people around these open source projects they were supporting and helping to maintain, and they've moved people around on these projects as well since then. Some of that started right around the time they dropped the bomb with CentOS and changed how it behaves.
So that change, there's a blog by a Red Hatter called Magnus Glantz, who sort of explained more or less the difference between downstream and upstream and the problem they had with CentOS. I actually showed you, I will share the links in the show notes, where he put a diagram where you can have the previous state of the flow of source code, where you had the community version, that's the upper upstream, I would say, where you can find Fedora. Then you had Red Hat Linux, and then you have the downstream, which is CentOS Linux. So that was the case until 3 years ago, right? And according to them, it was a broken flow, and they needed to fix it. And their way to fix it would be to keep Fedora on top, put CentOS Stream right under it as still an upstream distro, and then get Red Hat Enterprise at the end of the chain, which apparently for them is the right way to do things. So my question for you is that, does this model make sense? Or for me, for example, I'm no expert, but I'm thinking, why having a second layer if you have Fedora as an upstream? Why do we have 2 levels of upstream? But that's just me, but I'll let you share your take on this.
Well, you have to understand too, Red Hat's a business, and when they took control over CentOS, they had the right to do whatever they wanted to do with it. And so for them as a business, it probably didn't make sense to have Fedora, which is upstream, but now you have CentOS, which is upstream. So now they've gone to having 2 upstreams before things may or may not make it into Red Hat Enterprise Linux. I think before the change, you had Fedora, which is kind of the playground. That went into Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and then CentOS came out of Enterprise Linux. But there were things you could do with CentOS you might not be able to do with Red Hat, be able to add things into it that Red Hat didn't allow. And so you had a lot of people using CentOS that way. As far as what Red Hat has now, they have Fedora, which is an upstream. They have CentOS OS, which is another upstream. Neither of those have the stability that you need in a production environment. And now they have the paid for product that you have to pay to get access to, which is Red Hat. And, they're a business and they're allowed to make that change. But most open source projects only have one upstream. So this is a little different in what they've done to CentOS users. The bigger thing is what they did is CentOS was supposed to last for 10 years and they killed it 8 years ahead of schedule. So that also had a lot of people that were using CentOS for environments. They wanted that production stability, and that rug was ripped out from under their feet 8 years earlier. Was it a good decision for Red Hat? Probably, because they're able to sell more Red Hat Linux, but it definitely hurt the community. It definitely hurt a lot of people that were using CentOS because it was free and they could use it for home labs. They could use it for teaching, because generally if you did it in CentOS, the exact same thing worked in Red Hat. So you could use it to teach people technology. You could use it for your home lab so you could learn and test technology. And when Red Hat made that change in 2020, you lost that ability. So a lot of the technology people started moving away from the whole Red Hat family at that point as well, because they lost the ability to play with it at home. They lost the ability to use it for side projects where they didn't have budget for, Red Hat with all the support that came with it. So you kind of saw that impact as well. It's interesting how that's played out and where the community's gone with it.
Interesting. Well, I'm glad my assumption was not stupid in terms of number of upstreams for a distribution. One more question I would like to ask you. Obviously, you don't have the numbers, but we're just talking to each other. We're just, chilling here. Could you tell me how many, just broadly, customers of Red Hat that are paying subscriptions for production environment that have lower environments like test and dev running CentOS before they decided to pull the plug?
I know my customer base. I know I have a lot of customers that were on CentOS. They feel they didn't need to pick up the phone for tech support. These guys are really good. They know Linux really well. It's rare they would open up a ticket. And that's a lot of them where they use CentOS. I knew several people that would have Red Hat in their environment for production and then CentOS for dev test. But the bigger users that I saw just had CentOS everywhere, because they just didn't see a need to pay for tech support they would never use. They wanted to use a stable distribution, but they didn't want to be forced to pay for tech support when these guys are pretty smart and they'd have no intention of opening up a ticket. And I think that's one difference that, I work with Oracle a lot, and their distribution is similar to CentOS. It's free to use. It's free to download. You can free to distribute, but you don't pay for it at all. You just pay for support if you want it. And I've seen a lot of customers that were running CentOS move over to Oracle Linux because it was a model where they could have their non-prod be a curated, supported distribution where they didn't want to open up phones for tech support. But then their production, they absolutely wanted tech support, and they were able to pay tech support for those systems. And I've seen more of that as a change once CentOS was killed in 2020. Then I've seen where customers were running dev test in CentOS and production on Red Hat. Generally, they would run dev test in Red Hat as well for those type of customers.
So you agree that those customers that were using CentOS in lower environments like dev test, in terms of stability, they could no longer use the upstream version of CentOS nowadays to run their
they absolutely can't. Yeah, they absolutely cannot use that version for stability. And Red Hat's actually produced a path forward for them to migrate from CentOS to Red Hat. Oracle has produced a path for them for free where you can move from CentOS to Oracle. And then you have Rocky and Alma that were working on path where customers could convert from CentOS to those distributions as well. And most customers were converting to Oracle or Rocky or Alma. They weren't going to Red Hat.
Understood. I remember when Oracle proposed the conversion from CentOS to Oracle Linux, and I believe that time it was just a shell script that you could just run and make it become an Oracle Linux. So it was pretty straightforward. Now, that was the first hit, but we do have a second hit recently. So 3 years later, Red Hat came back and then said, surprise, my code is no longer available online. You will not have access to that anymore. So I would like to talk to you about the reasons for the community's concerns regarding the future of enterprise Linux because of this second move, which is like, I think maybe bigger, not just for hobbyists, but developers and maintainers of many open source projects that support Red Hat. Hundreds of them, I guess, like EPEL maintainers. You also have plenty of Alma Rocky users who did and do contribute to Fedora, the Linux kernel, EPL, etc. So I'd like to have your take on this.
Well, there's a couple things there, but the first thing I want to point out, when you had Rocky and you had Alma, the folks that were behind those projects were still contributing patches and bug fixes, or trying to contribute patches and bug fixes to the mainline distribution. In fact, one of the other things that happened in the last week is you had the folks at Alma Linux contribute a patch for a CVE. The CVE is a database that's by MITRE Corporation that tracks security vulnerabilities and exposures. That's what it stands for. To Red Hat to fix a problem with a known CVE. And Red Hat initially denied it. So I don't think you could say that Alma or Rocky were not adding to the code. You could say that adding to the code became difficult for them to add to the code, and not by choice. And in this particular CVE, it got a huge amount of exposure, and it took a couple of days, and Red Hat finally allowed that software to be patched for the security patch. But these companies are, these organizations, just like Oracle does as well, they contribute back into the mainline code, the upstream code, with bug fixes and features and things like that to make it better.
All right. So thing is, basically what happened is Red Hat decided to just paywall their open source code. Am I right?
Yeah. So what Red Hat decided,
kind of?
Yeah. What they decided is with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, which is a different distribution than CentOS is, right? CentOS Stream is not Red Hat. Red Hat made the business decision that if you want access to the source RPMs for what they've built for their distribution, that you now have to have a Red Hat account, that you have a contract with Red Hat that then gives you access to that source code. But as part of their contract, they also put in wording that you cannot distribute that source code. You can't share that source code with anyone, which is interesting from an open source aspect, because normally with open source, you know, the whole concept around these licenses, and it's not just the GNU public license. Apache has a license. GNU has a couple of ones. The GPL is GNU's public license from the GNU folks that make all the bits like the ls command and the find command and all these things that actually you use every day on a Linux system.
Speaking of which, no, they did it, but I would like to know first, if talk about the GPL and legal considerations to all this. First, discuss what the GPL, the GNU General Public License, allows and what it doesn't in terms of software distribution. And second, do Red Hat's action legally comply with GPL? Now, spoiler alert, yes, they do, right? But the code they're locking down is largely based on other people's open source code. So I don't know if it's an ethical problem or it doesn't seem fair. But I wanted to have your opinion on this because, apparently legally they can do it. So they're not breaching any GPL rules. But in the meantime, it's not super fair. What do you say?
Well, first of all, from a legal aspect, I'm not a lawyer, but I have worked with lawyers for years. I've talked to several lawyers. Two of them, actually, that I've talked to are very well-known intellectual property lawyers. One of them's won intellectual property cases and won against companies like Microsoft and Big Pen and IBM. And another one is intellectual property and has also won lawsuits against major companies as well. GNC, the supplements company, I think is one of them, and a whole bunch of others. And they've looked at the GPL and they've looked at what Red Hat's done. And both of them basically have said that Red Hat's not against the law, but not with the law either. They're definitely against the spirit of the law. As far as contractually, do they meet the terms of GPL? I don't think any lawyer has yet said yes. I also had a chance to talk with one of the Oracle lawyers that's heavily involved in the open source community. And his comment was he doesn't know. And he agreed that no one knows if they're legal, yes or no. But the challenge isn't necessarily that they're just legal, because there's a whole bunch of issues there. But the bigger question is, how does it hurt your users? And I think that's the bigger question to a person using Linux. Since CentOS is no longer anywhere close to what you get with Red Hat, if you are trying to research a bug as a software vendor, or if you're Apache, or you are Wireshark, or you are DISA, who Defense Information Security Agency that does a lot of security work called STIGs, Security Technical Implementation Guides. They tell you how to secure your systems. And you want access to the source code because you want to analyze it. It's difficult now to get access to it without a paid subscription. On top of that, if you want to share that source code with somebody, you now can't, because part of your access to that source code says you can't redistribute that source code. Even though that might be source code that Red Hat didn't even write, you still lose your ability to distribute that source code to somebody else. If you're trying to troubleshoot an issue and you're working with a team of people, and I've worked on Linux kernel stuff years ago. I did a lot of stuff with networking back in the 1.0 days. And we would have conversations and we would share code left and right. But if my only access to that code for Enterprise Linux 8.7 is from one company, and that company says I can't share that code anymore, and I'm trying to research a problem with 8.7, I've now lost my ability to get access to that code for 8.7 to troubleshoot it, whether it's a security issue or a performance issue or an availability issue. And I think that's the bigger challenge. What Red Hat has done is the community provides a ton of support. And by the community losing access to that technology, you're no longer going to have people easily being able to research and identify and enhance those specific versions that are behind the Red Hat paywall. And I think that's going to make you rely more on Red Hat support, because you're not going to be able to get a blog post as an example to how to fix something, because that blog post might want to include source code and now they can't include it because that only comes from Red Hat and they have a breach of contract. I think that's the bigger danger for users. Isn't necessarily what IBM's done and how upset they've made the community, because now you have people that wrote the code that now being told they can't even get access to it anymore. They have to get to it through the upstream, which doesn't actually match what the user's running, which is difficult when you're supporting something. ISVs are having similar issues. If you're writing a Docker Kubernetes engine, it's a little proprietary, you've done some special tweaks, and you don't have a Red Hat subscription, you're not able to support that anymore. So a lot of companies that were doing ISVs, independent software vendors, writing all this technology as commercial products, they're not having to go out and either decide to support Red Hat or not. Several of them are dumping Red Hat. Some of them are paying for it. But I think for the end user, it really hurts the end user there. I think that's the bigger thing to think about. Not is it legal or not, but how does it hurt you as a user of that technology, that a lot of the community that helps you use that and support you and find security vulnerabilities and find performance issues lose access to that specific version. It's kind of like Ford versus Chevy, back to my car analogy. I'm having the problem with my transmission on my Chevy that's made by transmission company A. But Chevy says I can't look at that transmission anymore. And I can go to the Ford and it has the exact same transmission, sort of, made by transmission company A, but it might be a little bit newer transmission and I have no way of knowing. And it makes it harder for me to support the customer behind it because those differences. And they're very unique to that build, that distribution.
That's a very interesting analogy. And I even need a follow-up question to understand it well. So you were referring to Chevy and Ford as Red Hat in another distribution, or? Yeah,
it could be two distributions. Again, Ford and Chevy, a lot of their parts come from the same manufacturers, right? They're by they make some things. They might make their transmission, they might make their engine, but their seats, their seat belts, airbags, brakes, all this other stuff comes from all these other different companies. And if Ford was to say, you can't buy the aftermarket brake pad that's made by the exact same company that makes our brake pads, because we're not going to tell you the bolt position of those brake pads. And then we're not going to legally let you take the brake pad off the car and look at the bolt positions yourself. If you do that, you're in breach of contract on your car, you lose your car. That's kind of what you're seeing there. So it's a really difficult scenario for the people that support it, that build a lot of the technology that sits on top of the operating system.
Really, really tricky.
That's the tricky thing with what's happened here.
Really, really tricky. So I think you referred to, I think I know the person from Oracle. I think it was Jim Wright, the chief architect and attorney specialized in open source policy and compliance. He, by the way, published an interesting article. It's a PDF. I'll show the link in the show notes. The title is Red Hat Enterprise Linux, is this open source? So that was like a rhetorical question. And first, he was just describing the definitions, the 4 free software essential freedoms, where one of the freedoms was freedom to redistribute copies to help others. And you do not have to ask or pay for permission to copy unless you're getting hard copies. And there was a second reference to the open source initiative definition to open source that says the same about free redistribution, which must allow for distribution in source code as well as compiled form. And even Red Hat's own definition of open source, I will share the link as well. They describe it this way. Open source software is code that is designed to be publicly accessible. Anyone can see, modify, and distribute the code as they see fit. So second, here where it goes kind of bananas, because according to the subscription service support terms, I will share the links as well in the show notes, of Red Hat, under Appendix 1, Section G, it says, any unauthorized use of the subscription services is a material breach of the agreement. Unauthorized use of the subscription services includes, there was A, B, and C is providing subscription services in whole or in part to third parties, and D, using subscription services in connection with any redistribution of software. So this is totally, I think, opposite to their own definition of open source, along with both OSI's and FSF's free software definition. So do you think the material breach means if, for example, I have a subscription, I got the binaries of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and I share it somehow with someone that is working for Alma Linux, for example, and they could use the source in order to, I don't know, go and update their version. Am I liable to, maybe they will cut me off or I'll be sued? We're just guessing though. But what do you think this kind of situation would lead the customer to if it ever happens?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that blog post from Red Hat from 2019, take a screenshot of it, because I suspect as many people as are referring to Red Hat's own definition of what open source is, I suspect that definition of how they define open source will likely have a subtle change to it.
I checked it today, actually, just before the podcast.
Yeah,
it's still available.
As many people, it's there, but as many people are pointing to that, you know, Red Hat is now IBM. They're a big organization. They move very slow, but they do move. I would not be surprised if that page gets edited, even if the date doesn't change. So I would take a screenshot of that page, check it back in 6 months and see what happens.
I will do that myself, and I guess a lot of people are doing that too.
A lot of people are. Yeah, we had a long conversation.
It's maybe in the archives as well. There's nothing that can be deleted online.
Yeah, anyway. Archive.org will have it, has it already, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
As far as what happens when you breach a contract, again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in contracts, so I do a lot of contracts through work. Generally, breach of contract is a bad thing in any sense, in a business sense, and you really don't want to do it because bad things happen to you. As far as what Red Hat will do when you breach the contract, that's really up to Red Hat. You know, it's their lawyers and their standards in their contract. So you'd have to look down to see what you lose in there. But it's just something as a person, you don't want to breach a contract. So you really want to be careful.
You bet.
About that.
You bet. For all the listeners, please don't do that at home. For sure, we're not actually suggesting anyone to do anything like that. Right. So a question regarding the downstream builders and Red Hat's perspective on them. Who are the downstream builders? Just if there's a way to just summarize, I know there's Alma, Rocky, Oracle, AWS Linux, and stuff. And then also, I wanted your opinion on why are they called freeloaders by Red Hat? What's the motivation behind this label? Is it just economical? Is it just because they're taking a piece of their pie? Or they're pissed at them because, they're just having support contracts that customers are paying for? So that's it. So 2 points. Who are they? And also why Red Hat is calling them freeloaders?
Yeah, so the 4 major ones you said are Alma, Rocky, Oracle, and AWS. AWS was a branch of Red Hat 7. They are now pulling more stuff from Fedora and kind of custom building their own distribution based off of Fedora. But they also, like Oracle, do a lot of research and development and bug fixes and features and things that they add as well. So they actively contribute to the upstream. You then have Alma and Rocky. Those were initially just builds of CentOS, but both of those also contributed to the upstream. And Red Hat used technologies from those organizations to also do things for their customers. An example in Alma, I just used the example from this last week where the folks at Alma were putting in a CVE and it was denied by Red Hat. And Red Hat publicly came out and said it just didn't meet their business needs to have Alma put that in to the source code to fix security issues. Again, Red Hat finally changed their approach to that for that one particular case. But it's not the only time there's been difficulty from these folks to put things into the upstream. Rocky Linux is done by a company called CIQ. What's really funny on that is a lot of the HPC stuff that Red Hat does comes from CIQ's open source HPC software built on top of, at that point was built on top of CentOS. So that's an interesting one because Rocky was using CentOS to add whole new open source packages on it. One of the also folks that at CIQ also does a lot of the Samba stuff, which makes it right into Red Hat as well. And Red Hat was using that into their distribution, but they said Rocky was a freeloader. And while Rocky probably didn't do a lot of kernel work, they did a lot of work in add-on applications that were part of the distribution or could be used easily with the distribution. And then you have Oracle, which is totally the opposite from what Red Hat said, that Oracle at times has put more into the Linux kernel than Red Hat has done. Oracle actually has a ton of open source that Red Hat uses that's in the Red Hat distribution. And if a really funny one I show people all the time, go to oss.oracle.com and just scroll down. And I haven't talked to anyone that's had the patience to get to the bottom of the list yet. Oracle puts a lot out there. They do a lot of kernel development. They support a lot of technologies like Btrfs, which is one of my favorite file systems. Fedora's had it. Red Hat's kind of had it, not had it. It's a better file system than XFS. I think it's more political why it hasn't made it into Red Hat yet, but a lot of distributions are using, including Fedora, Btrfs. And that comes out of Oracle. And then Oracle also, they invented through Sun NFS. And we all use NFS, and that's a technology that Oracle embedded into it. So they've been actively developing and supporting and enhancing the kernel. Even things like security patches. There's a whole repo you can get over at yum.oracle.com for patches to Red Hat's kernel that often get released by Oracle before Red Hat releases the patch to the kernel. And to me, that doesn't sound like a freeloader at all. And there's other enhancements that Oracle has given where you could take CentOS or Red Hat and you can use Oracle's UEK kernel, which changes the model because with UEK, you're getting a more up-to-date, I call it a more modern kernel. And that would allow you to do things like on a Red Hat 7 system that was a version 3 kernel, that you could put a UEK kernel on there and get a version 5 kernel. And you get all the performance enhancements and device driver enhancements and security enhancements, but still run Red Hat 7, just with a much more modern kernel. And to me, that's a huge enhancement. So that's not a freeloader. So yeah, I can't say why Red Hat says freeloader unless you look at the IBM acquisition and what obviously has to happen from there. But I
think some of them said it was not exactly freeloader that they used, or maybe it was not maybe it was somewhere in the Hacker News or some comments. by someone
No,
that
there
works
is
at
a Red Hat
Red Hat?
person that said freeloader. If you there's been a lot of discussions where Red Hat guys have said that. I think the quote you had from Mike was talking about adding value or changing it in any way.
Yeah, that's Mike McGrath.
Yeah.
That's the vice president of core platforms at Red Hat. He simply said, okay, so it's not freeloader, but he said, quote, simply rebuilding code without adding value or changing it in any way represents a real threat to open source companies everywhere. So this goes somewhere else, I guess.
It goes, but again, you have Alma trying to add in CVEs. To me, that's value. You have Rocky and CIQ adding in a lot of HPC code that Red Hat uses. The head guy at Rocky does a lot of work with Samba that Red Hat uses. To me, that's adding value. You have Oracle that's putting a huge amount of effort into all these open source projects out there, keeping them alive, keeping people working on them, taking technology that Red Hat's abandoned, like Spacewalk, and putting effort to keep that technology alive because it solves a valid business purpose for people. And it's something, a technology that people need for management. So I think they're adding value to the distro. How Red Hat wants to define value, I think that's really a question that Red Hat needs to answer.
Got it. It's still murky, still blurry. I mean, it doesn't seem clear as, or at least the claims are not backed much when you see the reality of the contribution of these cold, between brackets, freeloaders. I had one more question that's, I will admit, more personal, but a question related to the Yum repo, for example. So I remember back in the days, if I wanted to adapt one of my Vagrant builds, I had my subscription, but the free tier in Red Hat, but I could only use like 1 month worth of free subscription anytime. I'd have to renew it in order to have access to their Yum repo. So if I wanted to download any package, I would have to have a subscription registration in the repo communication, so I could sort of update any package I would like. And back in the days, I didn't have anything, so I used to go and try to fix the dependencies, which was a nightmare, because it was every time you think you fix 2 dependencies, there are like 100 others waiting. But it was still sort of closed in terms of RPMs. You wouldn't access to RPMs if you're just having the DVD of Red Hat. So you still need a registration. Could you help me understand like the fact that they are open source and the difference between closing the source and not allowing people to sort of update their packages through their Yum repo?
Well, with Red Hat, you have to have a subscription and a discussion. You cannot actually download an ISO legally without having a subscription for Red Hat. They require a subscription of some sort.
Correct.
As far as the same thing with their DNF, their Yum servers. In order to access those servers, you have to have a subscription. Whether it's a trial license, you renew somehow every 30 days, or you pay for a license, or however you get it, you have to have that subscription.
So could you explain to me the GPL definition of the free access to the binaries?
Well, the GPL, and there's other licenses involved. Well, it's not just GNU's licensing. Basically says if people are going to use your distribution, those people have to have access to the source code. And that's part of the GPL in version 1, version 2, version 3. There's different versions of the GPL and have different strings attached. But it just means you have to have access to the binary, to the source code for it. It assumes that you're going to be able to redistribute it, but Red Hat's reinterpreted that where they can lock it down through a subscription, and it's their organization, their company, their right to do that. But as far as access to Yum servers, Oracle's been giving free access to theirs since 2006. I mean, they've been doing this a long time. Rocky and Alma are also free access to their repos. They don't charge or anything to get access to theirs, just like Oracle. So they're very different builds. And I suspect that might have something to do with this whole lockdown. And what happened with the lockdown is Red Hat used to take for each version in their latest repos, they would publish source RPMs to a Git location where it was publicly available. Anyone could download and use it. And that's what a lot of these downstream rebuilders and enhancers, I hate to use the term rebuilder because a lot of these guys are enhancing the technology as well. We're using to have a base product to work to enhance and support and do what they do. So when Red Hat took that away, it kind of changed the market there as far as what they could and could do, but it's not impossible. So one of the things to think about too is all these bits and pieces that make up the version. Let's say it's Linux kernel 5.15. All that exists out there, that if you know you're on 5.15, you can go to the upstream provider and you can figure out what sub-release of 5.15 is available, and you can build your own distro. So they haven't totally killed the ability. What they've done is they've killed the ability to make it 100% identical to Red Hat. So that would be like Chevy saying, hey, we built our car and we bought the seats from this company and we bought the brake calipers from this company and the brake pads from this company. And if you buy a Chevy, you can't tell anyone where our brake pads come from. And you can't tell anyone where our calipers come from. But it's not going to stop Ford from building a car with brake pads and calipers that's going to look pretty much identical to the Chevy. It just makes it a lot harder to do. And I think that's the big change that you're seeing right now with the distros, is just making it harder for them to produce a technology. But you've had Alma come out and say they're going to maintain binary compatibility. You've had Rocky come out with, they have some tricks they're going to try to use to maintain compatibility. And you have Oracle come out with their published statement, which is they've had compatibility since 2006, and they're going to continue having that compatibility going forward. And if there's an issue, they're going to work with the ISV and the customer to resolve the issue. So I don't think Red Hat's necessarily killed these, quote, downstream providers. They've just made these downstream providers put a lot more effort in to having a technology that's compatible to what Red Hat's done.
Understood. So they made it tougher for the builders.
They made it tougher. But the reality is the big ones, Alma, Rocky, and Oracle, they're going forward. And some of the stuff that Oracle's doing, Alma and Rocky are pulling from too. So it's going to be really interesting, I think, to see where this ends up long term.
Interesting. All right. On this note, we've reached the end of this exciting episode of Tech Beats Unplugged, where we've been diving into the heart of open source debate and drama, part 1. Special thanks to our incredible guest, Erik Benner, who brilliantly explained this complex subject with simple words. And props to you, dear listeners, for sticking with us. Your support means everything, so please share and hit subscribe on Spotify to stay tuned, people, because we got more for you on part 2. Until then, keep grooving, baby. Signing off.